first time he asked what time I usually walked the dog, I thought he was just making conversation. I was 19 and home for the summer from college, picking up extra money by walking dogs for people in my neighborhood. One of those jobs was for a couple named Aaron and Elise, who lived in a gray house at the edge of an older subdivision, about 15 minutes from my place. They both worked downtown and were gone most weekdays until early evening. So my job was simple. I'd let their dog out around 1:30, walk him for 20 minutes, make sure he had water, and lock up when I left. The dog's name was Otis. He was a boxer with a white chest and a face that looked permanently disappointed in everybody. He walked slowly for the first few minutes, then a little faster once he got going. After the first week, I stopped thinking about the route because he knew it better than I did. We always went out the side gate, turned right on Linden Avenue, crossed at the stop sign, then looped around the back street where the larger houses were set farther apart and the trees shaded most of the sidewalk. Then we cut through a short alley beside a church lot and came back along Aaron and Elise's block. The first time I saw the man, he was kneeling by his front flower bed halfway down the back street. He looked up as Otis and I passed, smiled at the dog, and said, "Hot one." That was it. He seemed like any other neighbor. Mid-40s maybe, baseball cap, t-shirt, gardening gloves. The house behind him was a pale yellow place with trimmed hedges. I nodded, kept walking, and forgot about him. The next day, he was there again. This time he was standing by the mailbox with a hose in one hand. As we passed, he said, "Otis, right?" I slowed down slightly and looked at him. He pointed toward the dog's tag and gave a little shrug. I wasn't creeping. He's just got a big tag. That was fair enough. The tag really was easy to read. I laughed a little and kept going. After that, I started seeing him more often. Not every day. That was what kept me from feeling weird about it too soon. Sometimes he was watering flowers. Sometimes sweeping his walkway. Once he was washing his car. Nothing about his behavior was unusual on its own, and he never tried to stop me. It was just enough that after a while, I expected to see him somewhere on that same block. Then one Thursday, he asked, "You usually come later on Fridays, don't you?" I stopped walking. Not long. Just long enough that Otis turned and looked up at me. The man noticed my expression and smiled, almost apologetically. "I work from home," he said. "You start to notice routines." That made sense. On Fridays, I usually came later. Aaron worked from home until noon on Fridays, so he asked me to push the walk back to around 3. There was no reason for a stranger to know that, unless he had been paying attention for a while. The next week, I changed the route. Instead of taking Otis along the back street, I kept him on Linden the whole way and doubled around the block. It was less shaded and kind of annoying because the traffic was worse, but it avoided the yellow house entirely. Otis hated it. He kept trying to angle us back toward the usual turn, and by the time we got home, he was panting harder than normal. The following afternoon, the man was standing at the end of Aaron and Elise's street, not on his block, on theirs. He had one hand on a bicycle and acted like he was adjusting the chain, but the second he saw me coming with Otis, he straightened up and said, "Shortcut today?" I said, something like that. He nodded once and looked at the dog. He likes the old route better. I didn't answer. I just kept going. But by then my stomach had started doing that slow tightening thing it does when something simple stops feeling simple. That evening, I mentioned him to Elise when she got home early. I kept it casual because I still felt stupid making it sound like a bigger deal than it might be. I said there was a guy on one of the streets who seemed to notice when I walked Otis and had started commenting on it. Elise frowned. "Which house?" I described the yellow one with the hedges. She was quiet for a second and then said, "That's weird." When I asked if she knew him, she said no. Then she added that she thought the place had sold a few months ago, but she had barely seen anyone there. The next day, I paid closer attention to the house. The lawn was trimmed. A car was in the driveway. The curtains were open in the front room. It looked lived in. But I also noticed there were no trash bins out near the curb, even though it was collection day for that side of the street. Every other house had theirs out. Otis slowed as we passed. The man wasn't outside this time, but there was a stainless steel dog bowl sitting just inside the open gate, filled with water. Otis pulled toward it immediately. I stopped him short. That was what finally made me feel cold. The water bowl was in the exact place where a dog who took that sidewalk every day would naturally drift if someone wanted him to. I turned us around right there and brought him home. That afternoon, I texted Aaron and told him I didn't want to use the usual route anymore. He asked why, and I explained everything more clearly than I had to Elise. He called me almost immediately. The first thing he asked was whether the man had ever tried to touch Otis. I said no. Then he asked whether I had ever seen him near their house. I said yes, once. There was a pause before Aaron said, "Don't walk him tomorrow." He wouldn't explain over the phone, only said he'd tell me when he got home. The next evening, both he and Elise were there when I arrived. Aaron looked like he hadn't slept much. He asked me to sit down, and then told me something I was not expecting. About a month before they hired me, someone had opened their side gate while they were both at work. Nothing was taken, but Otis had been led into the backyard from the mudroom, where they usually kept him during the day. A neighbor saw a man standing at the fence, trying to coax the dog over with something in his hand. When the neighbor yelled, the man walked off. They never found out who it was. That night, Aaron drove the route with me in his truck after dark. The yellow house looked almost empty from the street. One lamp on. No car visible. No movement. But as we slowed by the curb, I saw the dog bowl again, still inside the gate. And hanging from the latch above it was one of Otis's old chew ropes. I recognized it because Elise had shown me a basket of his toys on my first day, and laughed about how he destroyed every rope, except one frayed blue one he kept dragging from room to room. Aaron saw it too. He didn't say anything right away. He just kept driving. I never walked Otis again after that. What stayed with me was not the bowl, or even the toy. It was how ordinary the whole thing looked from a distance. A man in his yard, a dog bowl by a gate, small comments about the weather and the road. Nothing dramatic enough to make you react immediately. Until it became clear he wasn't just noticing our routine. He was learning how to interrupt it. The first thing he ever asked for was a screwdriver. That was why I didn't think much of him at first. I was 21 and living with my older sister in a small rental house on a quiet street near the edge of town. It was the kind of neighborhood where people mostly kept to themselves, but still noticed when someone new moved in. The house next to ours had been empty for about a month when a man in his late 30s or early 40s moved in by himself. I only met him because the day after his moving truck showed up, he knocked on our side door around 6 in the evening and asked if we had a Phillips head screwdriver he could borrow for a bed frame. He looked tired, like someone who had spent all day carrying boxes, and he spoke the way polite neighbors do when they know they are interrupting. I grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen junk drawer, handed it to him, and he thanked me twice before leaving. He brought it back maybe 20 minutes later. That was what made him easy to trust. A lot of people borrow things and forget to return them for days. He handed it back clean, said thanks again, and that was it. 2 days later, he asked to borrow a tape measure. A week after that, it was a small stepladder because he wanted to change a smoke detector battery and hadn't unpacked his tools yet. Every request was minor. Every request also seemed reasonable. My sister thought he was a little awkward, but harmless. I did too at first. He never lingered at the door, never tried to force conversation. never acted overly friendly. If anything, he seemed careful not to come off as weird. That was probably why I ignored the first few comments that should have bothered me. One evening when I handed back the ladder, he looked at my sister's scrubs and asked, "You work nights?" She just nodded and said sometimes. Another time, when I was leaving for class in the afternoon, he happened to be getting his mail and said, "You're usually gone by this time, right?" I laughed a little and said, "Usually." He shrugged and said he was trying to figure out when the mail actually came because he kept missing it. On their own, none of those things sounded strange. He was a neighbor. Neighbors notice routines. They see who leaves early, who gets home late, which cars belong to which house. That is just part of living close to other people. What changed things for me was the package. It happened about 3 weeks after he moved in. I got home from class around 2 and found a small box on our porch with his address written on it in black marker. Not a shipping label, just the number next door scribbled large across the top. I figured the delivery driver had misread the curb numbers and dropped it at our place by mistake. So I carried it over and knocked. He answered almost immediately, which was odd because his car wasn't in the drive, and I had just assumed he was out. He looked at the box and smiled in a way that made it seem like he had been expecting it. "Thanks," he said. "I was hoping they wouldn't leave it sitting there." I told him it had just come to the wrong porch. Then he said, "If something gets dropped here again while I'm working, you can just set it inside my side gate." That was the first time I hesitated. It implied a level of familiarity we didn't actually have. I said sure anyway, mostly because I didn't want to make a small thing awkward. The next day, I noticed his side gate. It was half open. There was no dog in his yard, no tools, nothing that explained why he'd specifically wanted a package set inside it instead of just taking it later from his porch. A few days after that, he knocked again. This time he asked if I could leave our side gate unlatched the following afternoon, because a tree guy might need to get through the narrow alley between the houses if he wasn't home in time. He said it casually, like it was no bigger a favor than borrowing the screwdriver had been. I said no. Not rudely, just directly. He nodded right away and said he understood. That should have ended that. But the next afternoon, when I got home, our side gate was unlatched anyway. I knew I had locked it because I had taken the trash bins out through there that morning and pulled it shut behind me. The latch on that gate made a specific metal click when it caught, and I remembered hearing it. I told myself the wind might have jarred it loose. Then I noticed the hose. We kept a green garden hose coiled on a wall hook in the backyard. It was lying stretched halfway across the grass, still damp near the nozzle like someone had used it recently. Neither my sister nor I had touched it in days. That evening, I asked her if she had gone into the backyard before work. She said no. I told her the gate had been open and the hose had been moved. She frowned, but only for a second. Then she said, maybe the neighbor had reached through and used it because his outdoor spigot wasn't working yet. When I asked why he wouldn't just ask, she said, maybe he thought one of us had already said it was fine. The next week, he came by one more time to borrow something. This time, it was the extension ladder we kept beside the shed in the back. He said he wanted to clean out the leaves from his gutters before rain came through, and asked where we bought it, because he was planning to get one too. I helped him carry it around to the front because it was awkward to move alone. While we were walking it down the driveway, he asked, "You keep this out back all the time?" I said yes. He looked toward our upstairs windows as he adjusted his grip on the ladder. Then he said, "Makes sense." That sentence sat in my head much longer than it should have. He returned the ladder before dark. 2 days later, I came home sick from class around 11:30 in the morning. My sister had already left for work, and I remember being annoyed because I knew she wouldn't be home until almost midnight, and I'd be alone with a fever and nothing in the fridge except yogurt and leftover rice. I parked in the driveway and immediately saw our side gate standing open. Not just unlatched, open wide enough that it had swung back against the fence. I stayed in the car for a second, staring at it. Then I noticed something above the roofline. Metal. A ladder. I got out and walked around the side of the house carefully, already knowing what I was going to see before I actually saw it. Our extension ladder was leaning against the side of the house beneath my sister's bedroom window. The neighbor was standing halfway up it. He wasn't at his gutters. He wasn't on his property. He was facing our house with one hand on the rung and the other resting near the windowsill like he had just been about to try it. He looked down the second he heard the gate hit the fence. For one full second, we just stared at each other. Then he climbed down slowly and said, "Your shutter looked loose." I remember how stupid that sounded even in the moment. We didn't have shutters on that side of the house, just plain siding and the window trim. I said nothing. He stepped off the ladder and let go of it, then added, "I was going to tell you." Again, I said nothing. He looked toward the driveway, then back at me, like he was trying to decide whether the lie still sounded workable if he kept talking. Finally, he said, "I didn't think anyone was home." That was the only honest thing he said. I backed away without taking my eyes off him, went through the gate, got in my car, and drove straight to my sister's work. I waited in her parking lot until her lunch break and told her everything. We never went back to that house alone after that. Our landlord changed the gate latch, the back door lock, and the window hardware that same night. The neighbor was gone by the end of the month. No moving truck, no goodbye, just his driveway empty and his blinds open one morning like he had walked away from the place all at once. I was 20 and living with my older sister in a side-by-side duplex while I finished community college. She worked long shifts at an urgent care clinic, and I had a mix of classes and part-time hours at a bookstore, so our schedules barely lined up. Most afternoons, there was a 2 or 3 hour stretch when I was home alone. The other half of the duplex had been empty for almost a month when the new neighbor moved in. He came over the day after the truck left. Mid-30s maybe. Dark hair, plain gray t-shirt, a little out of breath, like he had been carrying boxes. He stood on our side porch and asked if we had a Phillips screwdriver he could borrow, because he had unpacked the wrong toolbox. I got one from the kitchen drawer, handed it over, and he brought it back 20 minutes later, exactly like he said he would. After that, it was little things. A tape measure, a box cutter, a flashlight when the power flickered one night, and he said he had not found his candles yet. Each time he came over, he was polite and brief. He never pushed the door wider, never tried to start a long conversation, never did anything obvious that would have made me suspicious. That was probably why it took me so long to notice that he only knocked when my sister was gone. He worked from home, or at least that was what he told me, so maybe he just happened to need things during the day. But after the 4th or 5th time, I realized he had never once come over while both of us were there. Not at dinner, not on a Sunday morning, only in those narrow windows when he could reasonably assume I was alone. The first comment that bothered me came a week later. He was returning the tape measure, and as I reached for it, he glanced toward the driveway and said, "Your sister still on nights?" I said sometimes. He nodded and said, "Her car's gone before 6 most days." That was the sort of thing a neighbor could notice without meaning anything by it. Still, I remember the way he said it. Not as a question, more like confirmation. A few days after that, he knocked again. This time he had a small package in his hand addressed to him. "Porch pirates got me at the old place," he said. "If something gets dropped while I'm out, would you mind setting it inside my side gate?" I said sure, because it seemed harmless. Then he added, "You're usually home by 4 anyway, right?" I looked at him a second longer than I meant to. He smiled faintly and lifted one hand. "Sorry, I just keep weird hours." I said nothing to that. That evening, I mentioned him to my sister while she was changing for work. She half listened and said he just sounded nosy. Then she laughed and told me to stop being so nice to people with moving boxes. I wish I had listened to that part. The next week, while she was at work, he knocked again in the middle of a thunderstorm. He said he had locked himself out taking the trash to the curb, and his phone was inside. Could he please use mine to call his landlord? That felt more awkward to refuse than the screwdriver had. I did not want to invite him all the way in, so I stayed in the doorway and handed him my phone. He looked at it, then up at the rain, then back at me. "Would you mind if I stepped just inside?" he asked. "It's getting soaked." I hesitated too long. He must have seen that on my face, because he quickly added, "Just the entryway. I'm sorry." So I let him step inside the front hall. He called a number, spoke quietly for maybe 15 seconds, thanked me, and handed the phone back. Then he glanced down the short hallway toward the kitchen and said, "Same layout as mine, huh?" I said I guessed so. He smiled once and left. Nothing happened right away after that. That was part of what made me doubt myself. Then small things in the house started feeling wrong. My sister's spare key, which she always left in the ceramic bowl by the microwave, turned up in the junk drawer under a stack of takeout menus. A kitchen chair I had left pulled out was pushed neatly back in. Once I came home and the porch light was on, even though I knew I had switched it off before class. Each thing was easy to explain away on its own. Together, they felt like a bad pattern I did not want to name. The next time he came over, he did not ask to borrow anything. He was standing by the fence between our units when I took the trash out, and he said, "You guys should really replace that back door lock." I stopped. "What?" He nodded toward our kitchen door. "It sticks. Looks like it barely catches." I asked how he would know that. He shrugged and said, "You can hear it from outside when it doesn't shut clean." The back door was in the fenced part of our yard. The only way to hear it clearly was to be standing much closer to it than a neighbor normally would. That night, I told my sister everything, including the storm and the phone call and the comment about the lock. She took me more seriously then, not because any single thing sounded terrible, but because she knew I was not dramatic by nature. The next morning, before she left for work, she did something small. She tore a receipt in half and tucked one piece under the edge of the back mat so only the corner showed. Then she wedged the other half in the front door frame near the hinge side. "If someone opens either door, we'll know," she said. I felt ridiculous agreeing to that. I felt a lot less ridiculous when I got home that afternoon. The back receipt was gone. Not moved. Gone. The front one was still in place. I called my sister immediately. She told me not to go inside. I did anyway, because I was already halfway through the kitchen before I remembered what she had said. Nothing looked wrong. Then I saw the key bowl. It was sitting on the counter beside the sink instead of by the microwave. Next to it, neatly lined up, were all 3 keys from the bowl. My house key, my sister's spare, and a silver blank key that did not belong to us. I stood there staring at it for a full 10 seconds before my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "Are you inside?" I wrote back. "Yes." Then, from the living room, I heard the floorboard by the front window creak. Not a settling noise, a footstep. I backed out of the kitchen without turning around, grabbed my keys off the counter, and left through the side door into the yard. His truck was not in his driveway, but as I got into my car, I looked through our own front window and saw him standing just inside the living room curtain, one hand still holding the edge of the fabric open. He did not wave. He did not try to hide. He just looked at my car like I had come home too early. I drove straight to my sister's work and waited there until her shift ended. We never stayed in that duplex again after that night. Our landlord changed the locks and acted offended, that we would even suggest the neighbor had been inside, but he still let us out of the lease a month early. I think the only reason he did was because the man next door was suddenly gone within the week. No truck, no porch light, no explanation. What stayed with me was not the moment I saw him in the window. It was how ordinary he had made everything before that. The screwdriver, the flashlight, the package, the phone call in the rain. None of those moments felt dangerous on their own. That was the point. He was never trying to seem harmless. He was practicing being expected.